Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Open to Export webinar on international shipping, working with intermediaries and the impact of Brexit. My name is not William Barnes-Graham. Unfortunately, he's off with the flu at the moment. My name is Ian Stalham. I am the Education Manager at the Institute of Export and International Trade. Next slide, please. Open to Export is a free online service helping small businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our export action plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find all of these on our website at opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's professional membership body for traders, endorsed by the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as a small business champion. We offer a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training, catering for beginners right through to a master's degree, and always exciting, prestigious program of events celebrating UK businesses exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A later in the session, and you can ask questions at any point using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We have already been sent loads of questions ahead of today's webinar, so we cannot guarantee we will get everything we receive. The general principle we adopt is that we'll only ask questions that are relevant to the broader audience, so we won't be able to go into company specifics as such. If you do have specific questions, we can refer you to our technical helpline afterwards. You can also download a PDF of the slides at any point via the handout drop-down on your control panel, and you'll be able to watch a recording of this webinar on opentoexport.com/webinars within a day of it finishing. Right, for now though, it's my pleasure to welcome two great speakers. Later, we'll hear from George Baker, who has vast experience in the industry from leading the UK's largest independent customs broker. First, though, it is my delight to hand over to John Lucy, who is representing the Freight Transport Association today. John, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Could I have the next slide, please? There we go, thank you. So in this section, we're going to be looking at the potential impacts on supply chains when we reach the end of this year's transition period. And we're going to be looking really why it's inevitable that supply chains are going to change next year and onwards, and what the implications of these changes may be for UK exporters. So next slide, please. So this very colourful image potentially illustrates why the Brexit process has taken so many twists and turns over this last few years. Many politicians wrongly thought that keeping the UK in some kind of customs union with the EU would mean frictionless trade. However, this is simply not the case. Turkey, we can see to the right of the diagram there, it's in a customs union with the EU, and Norway over to the left of the image is in the EU single market. But imports and exports from both of these countries still have customs procedures, and they both have friction at their respective borders with the EU. We know now that the UK is committed to leaving both the single market and the customs union on the 31st of December this year. The government has recently announced that there will be absolutely no extension beyond this date, and that full border controls will be introduced after the transition period ends in December. The outcome of any free trade agreements or trade negotiations which are currently underway, and whether they are agreed or not, is now immaterial to the physical movement of goods across our borders from January the 1st next year. There will be customs requirements no matter what the outcome of this trade agreement is. So next slide, please. So what will be the impact on supply chains? Well, we've identified at the FTA 4 key risk areas for the supply chains to consider really. Firstly, under red tape, understanding what the new border requirements will be, what is required, when and where it needs doing, and how to do it. We now know that existing custom procedures will apply to EU traffic, but the question is how it will work in practice at the various Ro-Ro ports, both in the EU and in the UK. In terms of border delays, well, if you consider that there's over 10,000 trucks per day crossing the Dover Straits, it doesn't take long at the moment for any delay to have a significant impact on traffic flows. Last time there was customs on UK European freight was prior to 1993, and then there was 220 customs agents in Dover alone. Today there are only 17, and obviously the volumes are far, far higher than they were in the early 90s. And the same scenario applies to all the other UK and European ro-ro ports to some extent. Skill shortage. Current estimates suggest a shortage of over 40,000 customs intermediary staff who will be required to process the expected increase in declarations next year. This sector urgently requires new entrants and a professional pathway to attract staff. Additionally, there is an estimated shortage in the UK of some 50,000 truck drivers, and with many EU nationals currently working in the UK as drivers for UK companies, tougher new immigration rules next year could probably increase or potentially increase these driver shortages. In terms of market access, road haulage is one of the key negotiation points in the current trade deal negotiations. In the worst case scenario, quoted permits may be required, which will potentially limit truck supply in some cases, both for the UK-based and the EU-based hauliers. Now, together, all of these factors are adding up to significant potential cost and time implications in order to cross borders. So now we're going to look at some of these risk areas in a slightly more detail. So next slide, please. So many of you may recognise this image. This was from the previous original Day 1 No Deal planning from the Department of Transport. There was 4 stages of stacking vehicles on the Kent corridor, basically from the Port of Dover upwards, up to a maximum of 11,600 vehicles they reckon they could contain within this area once it actually shuts off the M26. This idea is now being scrapped and it's been replaced by a new procedure which incorporates movable concrete barriers to create contraflows on the M20 and on the M2 and potentially on the M26 also. And this is going to be on operational standby for December this year. So instead of having permanent barriers in place throughout the back end of this year, this is going to be a more of a reactive process. So the reason why these vehicles will be parked in Kent now, these are not inbound vehicles, these are exporting vehicles. We will probably see a little bit more detail on the next slide, please. A bit of a grainy picture this, but this is the new Brexit readiness facilities in the port of Calais. The left-hand picture shows the inspection bays, 6 of them, for phytosanitary checks for vehicles arriving with UK agri products on. And opposite them, there's a 4-bay facility for general customs and risk analysis checks. So on the basis, it's a brand new facility. It works very well with a limited volume, but when we talk about thousands of vehicles per day, you can start to see where the potential problems are going to be in terms of delays, etc. During trials that we were involved in last autumn, we went through this whole process with 2 ferry loads of vehicles, 100 trucks each, and the consensus at the time amongst the authorities on the ground there that they reckoned if you're an arriving vehicle with agri products on needing to go to both facilities, you will probably be looking about 2.5 to 3 hours from arrival to clearance, assuming that everything is okay in terms of paperwork and export certificates, etc. So if one imagines that every hour on the hour there's a ferry arriving from the UK with at least 100 vehicles on it, you can soon see why the delays take part. There's probably about a space for 100 vehicles in this facility with another 100 beside it. So within 3 hours, you've got 300 vehicles and they're only processing one every 2 or 3 hours. That's where the problems will come. And that's why you'll probably get more than likely traffic delays in Kent. And just before we move on, just one point that came out of this, if you are going to be clearing goods within the Port of Calais itself, you need to appoint a port agent or your French import agent needs to have a port representative. Drivers are not allowed to exchange paperwork with the authorities in this facility. So even if you're only exporting to Paris, your local French agent still needs to appoint another intermediary within the port itself. So it's a small detail, but it's a big detail because that means nothing will happen at all. Even if all your paperwork is correct and there's no problems whatsoever, without an intermediary, your vehicle and your goods will not proceed. Next slide, please. So we can start to see changes all around. Really, this is a big bang change towards supply chains and every option. We're going to be experiencing rerouting to different ports, alternative modes of transport and forms of transport, potential problems with the EU subcontractors, and some larger changes in general to supply chains. So why are we going to get alternative ports and alternative modes? Well, we're seeing a trend already to shipping trailers on their own, i.e. unaccompanied, as it's known. Where will these go? Well, basically any other Ro-Ro ports away from the Dover Straits. The regional Ro-Ro ports, such as on the south coast and on the east coast of the UK, they're all expected and they're all gaining business now as the Brexit story unfolds. Basically because they're more suited to Brexit because of the customs requirements for the delays on the start and the end of the journey. The ferries have longer crossing times. They generally have more trailer parking space in these ports. And as most of them are container ports also, they already have the infrastructure in place for checking cargo and clearing customs. And the reason the unaccompanied trailer market is taking, or that change in mode to unaccompanied is taking off, is because the general accepted benefits or the competitive advantage of driver company freight in terms of time and cost will basically disappear overnight, really. The vast majority of European or UK to the Europe road freight is carried, 90% of this is carried by European subcontractors. If there's restrictions on the market's access, it will also apply to the EU haulers, and there'll be a shortage in terms of capacity, as we've seen. In previous problems with Calais in 2015, when we had 30-mile queues on the M20, for example, when there were strikes in Calais, the general haulier community within Europe tends to avoid the UK for several weeks on end. So we may have some sort of unintended consequences where there's apprehension amongst the general hauliers who don't want to come to the UK, or they don't understand the processes, and they'll just basically avoid it as a market, which then, because we're so reliant on the EU hauliers and there may be market restrictions on the UK hauliers, that may then lead to indirect stockpiling of imports abroad where they can't be lifted and come into the UK. Excuse me. So in general, supply chain changes, we potentially the whole benefits of Brexit is more UK exports. So with new trade deals, currency fluctuations, we can expect to see a natural switch away from the EU market, which can increase opportunities for UK exporters to markets other than Europe. The effect on this on supply chains will be, for example, if what President Trump said is correct and we end up tripling our trade with the USA, well, that's a tripling in the amount of container traffic coming to the northwest ports. So you can kind of see where the direction of travel of this is going, where if international supply chains change, where and when and how these goods arrive into the UK or leave the UK, this starts affecting, there'll be a complete sea change in how things will work in the future. So next slide, please. So I know George is going to go into more detail of what you need to do in terms of the technical detail in terms of customs. This basically is just a basic checklist for possibly companies or established exporters who aren't very au fait with the customs procedures. So the list on the left of the slide gives you an example of it. This is what you're going to need to be providing to your freight agents or your customs agents in order to get your goods moving. So you're going to need to understand your tariff code, the country of origin, proofs of export, any particular licenses for your products. And the new one, if you're dealing with Europe, is understand which Incoterms are going to be best for your situation in terms of risk with your buyers of your goods. So again, I'll fly through this one because it'll be covered in more detail with George's presentation. Next slide, please. This is from the, if you imagine, from the hauliers or the driver's point of view, actually to get the vehicle on the ferry. There was a misconception earlier last year or towards the last Brexit date that it was going to be many vehicles sort of slipping through the nets of controls, either arriving in the UK or leaving the UK without the correct documentation. George will go into this in more detail in this presentation, but unless things change between now and the end of the year, what the port authorities and what the enforcement authorities will be looking at of all these, when the vehicles start approaching the ports of Dover or Eurotunnel or whichever port it is, the vehicle has to be deemed border ready. And what the staff on on the ground who are looking for, who aren't customs agents. They're not. It's not in our interest. All they're being trained in really is to look for the MRN, the movement reference number, which tends to be a barcode on the top of most basic export and transit documents. And this is the kind of terminology that they'll be looking for. And of course, the drivers need to be re-educated in all this as well. So the whole knowledge transfer in what's going to be required for the 1st of January is a vast problem, really. So in essence, the driver needs to understand that he was not allowed out of the country and he will not be allowed onto the ferry without a movement reference number or some other legitimate customs documentation. So next slide, please. So the two must-have documents or pieces of data that the driver must have, or he will not be allowed to board the ferry in the first place. One's a UK TAD movement reference number, where the barcode is scanned at the ferry terminal or the train terminal, and that data is paired with the truck reg and then sent to the French customs when the ferry departs. And on board the ferry, the drivers then have a large screen on the ferry itself where they have to look at the screen, and they have a traffic light system for this. So the vehicles, at the information, the data is being processed by the French customs on the Dover-Calais crossing, for example. If it goes code orange, or they get an orange light, an amber warning light, that basically means that the driver has to then go to proceed to customs controls in the Port of Calais, as we saw on that previous slide earlier where we've seen the facilities. If it's a green light, then they can proceed directly out the port. But seeing what I've seen, the vast majority of vehicles will probably go code orange for an inspection, or they have to be inspected because they're carrying agricultural products, which we'll go into more detail shortly on the next slide. So next slide, please. This is a basic sort of process map really on what's going to be happening. I mean, the export procedure, if you're familiar with exporting with the rest of the world, it's exactly the same. It's just basically a copy and paste of the procedures and what needs to be done. We will apply to European freight. So right now, you just load a vehicle. It'll be in Poland in 2 days' time without any paperwork whatsoever. The whole procedure will slow down now. So the declaration needs to be done based on the information on the origin, the tariff, etc., and the weight of goods and so on, the value, and so on and so on. The agent submits that to customs. We will then give the permission to proceed, which needs to be cleared before the vehicle actually leaves to go for export. Once it arrives at the port of export or the crossing of the border territories, for example, if it's Dover-Calais, that the customs documentation will need to be scanned or stamped, whatever type of documentation it is, as it leaves the UK, and again on arrival into the EU at Calais, and then it can transit through, if it's moving under transit, into an authorised consignee in Poland, where the goods will then clear customs and any duties or VAT will be paid. And only then can the final delivery take place. So for example, you will probably need to consider that's going to be adding 1 or 2 days to whatever transit time that you allow for your goods moving at the moment. So that's a real brief overview of customs requirements. George will go into slightly more detail in this presentation. However, if you're an exporter and you're exporting animal and plant-based products, there are additional checks and procedures to comply with. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is going to be a big one now, particularly for the UK and the Irish markets, because obviously we're big exporters of agricultural produce. Now this is going to go to the wire in terms of negotiations with the EU in terms of our trade agreement. So there's 2 mandates. We'll go into more detail shortly, but if you could understand the negotiating stance for this now. So the basic hardline stance from the EU is that they're going to introduce systematic sanitary and phytosanitary checks at the border, i.e. border control posts. Whereas the UK, our priorities are we're going to maintain a separate sanitary and phytosanitary regime with no alignment to EU standards. So obviously that's where the SBS checks come through. However, we will seek equivalence measures that, if agreed, could offer preferential conditions. So that's the bit of leeway in a negotiating stance. But the whole underlying principle to the negotiations is symmetry. So where the UK is not prepared to unilaterally waive any requirements that the EU doesn't reciprocate. So if we're going to have a hard regime in the EU, that will also be put in place at the UK ports, which is going to be a big ask for the UK because we haven't got hardly any of these border collection inspection points at any of our Ro-Ro ports at the moment because it's never been required. So this is an added problem for exporters of agri products. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is basically illustrating the likely range of possible outcomes from these negotiations. So as for you as an export audience, the hard or the soft lines of the inspections, you can see now this is going to go to the wire with negotiations. So bear in mind, it's still actual negotiations. So from one extreme where there is a full set of EU requirements, this is going to mean 100% documentary and identity checks, physical checks on up to 50% of consignments on certain categories of products. Or at the other extreme, we could go to a New Zealand style agreement where there are less frequent physical checks, maybe only 1 or 2%, digitalized processes to speed up the system in total, and a reduction in inspection fees, some 22.5% lower than a default offer to other non-EU countries who don't have an SBS agreement with Europe. However, for an exporter, you must expect that you would have to produce export health certificates for any of your outbound flows, and understand that you'll have to have a documentary ID physical checks on your goods at whichever EU border they arrive in. There may be some possibility to have some, but not all checks carried out at the place of destination. But again, this is part of the negotiation procedure. And because of the symmetry principle, there will be similar arrangements on inbound flows. So if you are an importer as well, this is going to be coming through for European imports into the UK. Next slide, please. So in summary, if you were exporting animal or plant-based products into the EU, our advice is to start studying possible rerouting options. You need to take into account not only the availability of a border control point at certain locations, but also the type of products that each entry point is authorised. Not all border control points will process or be able to process all types of products. For example, in France now, if you're carrying fish exports, which is obviously a big Scottish and Irish export commodity, the only border inspection post or border control points which will accept fish products is in the port of Boulogne. So if you're arriving in any northern French ports or Calais, you may be able to do your customs there, but you still need to be able to do your physical inspection of the goods into Boulogne. So there's lots of rerouting involved in it, and not all of them will be able to take frozen or chilled pack or products, or they might not be able to take bulk products or packaged products only, and so on and so on. So there's lots to consider, probably more to consider in terms of agri products than there actually is with customs, because there are limited facilities offering this type of service. Next slide, please. And one unintended consequence from this falling out of the EU standards is the requirements for our wooden pallets to be heat treated, obviously to prevent insect infestations. This is normal for exports, particularly to Australia and America, who are very, very keen on this, not allowing any alien species in. But of course, on the 31st of December going to the 1st of January, our insects suddenly become alien to the EU. So this will come into force. The UK has decided that, or it stated up to the last Brexit, they were not going to enforce this on EU goods coming into the UK. The EU stance on UK exports going to the EU, again, is still to be determined, but one has to expect, and at this moment in time, that particularly if you're exporting goods which are going to be subject to SBS checks, by default, they will also be checking the pallets to make sure that heat treated, stamped and certified. So this is just an added small detail, but again, this could be quite a problematic practical detail on the ground. And obviously, because we've never needed these apart from small markets at the moment, there's quite a shortage of these in the UK market. So the pallet manufacturers are actually ramping up production, but they're still anticipating to be quite a shortage, and the price of these obviously is going up because of supply and demand. And last slide, please. So we can't really say too much about Northern Ireland because this is still to be decided all year, but this is the basic principle of how the process, the export process from the UK into Northern Ireland and potentially into the Republic of Ireland or the EU is going to work. Nothing like this has ever been done before anywhere else, so it's going to be quite an interesting journey how this works out in practice. There's going to be a legal but an invisible customs border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. However, in practice, the customs border will be between GB and the island of Ireland, with goods being checked at the point of entry in Northern Ireland. Duties and taxes won't automatically have to be paid on goods coming into Northern Ireland from GB. However, where there are goods deemed at risk of moving onwards into the Republic of Ireland and therefore Europe, duties then become payable. Now, the Northern Irish Joint Committee will decide on what goods are considered at risk and how it's going to work on the ground. So there's going to be lots of details coming out of this year, but this is the basic plan. It sounds incredibly complicated and it's quite difficult to understand how this is going to be enforced, but it has to be, because this is going to be one of the key criteria of our agreements with Europe going forward. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for an insightful and informative presentation. Now we have our second panelist, George Baker. Over to you, George.
Hello, this is George. Good afternoon to you. Next slide, please. Customs export declarations. Let's start with the fundamentals. Customs require all imports and exports to be declared. We know traditionally when passing through ports and airports, we're asked, have you anything to declare? If you're exporting goods to a non-EU country, you must always declare each and every shipment. Now, since 1993, UK goods destined for another EU member state have not been considered to be exports for customs purposes. Export declarations have not been necessary for these inter-EU movements. But we have left the EU now, so this will change completely after the current Brexit implementation period ends. Exports to EU countries will suddenly need full customs declarations, and this may happen as early as 1st of January 21, which we know is the first date on which the borders may go up. Next slide, please. So, making a customs declaration, if you're an exporter, you have to use the National Export System, NES, to declare your exports. There's no facility to do a paper declaration. NES is a computer-based system which allows customs entries, export customs entries, and declarations to be made electronically. You can only do it electronically. NES is part of HMRC's Customs Chief system. That's a long established system which deals, as cleverly the name was put together, customs handling, import and export freight. Now you need to set up links to use the system, and the use of commercially available softwares is already also recommended. I mean, there are many of them available. HMRC insists that anyone wanting to complete the export declaration must have a good working knowledge of the customs tariff. And in other words, they're saying that you shouldn't be attempting an export declaration online unless you have some degree of competence. Incorrect declarations can result in delays to shipments, and sometimes even HMRC seizure of the goods. So listen to the customs advice and think about the need for good working knowledge, and be sure to read the government's best practice guides. These are guides available online to give you some degree of indication of what kind of level of knowledge you would need. Next slide, please. Use of an intermediary. Most exporters prefer to use a trained intermediary to submit entries on their behalf rather than submit their own declarations. Now, the Brexit situation may mean that some exporters have a massively increased volume of declarations to do, and they may need to think about taking these in-house rather than suffering the cost of giving multiple declarations to an intermediary. That's a commercial decision they would want to take. On a one-off kind of situation, the freight forwarder or logistics company carrying or arranging the shipment can usually offer an export entry service. They can do the declaration, and that can be very useful for an occasional or one-off or urgent export shipment. But regular exporters sending goods to multiple countries of destination often feel more secure with online support, ongoing support from a professional. Accordingly, many use the service of an established and qualified customs broker or customs agent. They get these guys to fill in the forms and submit their entries. Now, the chief system is getting rather old. It's an aging system, old technology, which needs to be replaced soon by a completely new customs declaration service called CDS. And the government had actually embarked on this project before the referendum, shortly before the referendum. So this isn't directly linked to the 1121 situation, but we do need a robust government system to handle all the increased declarations. The problem is that every customs documentation clerk in the UK will need to be retrained to operate on CDS. It's going to look very different. Some exporters feel that training their own staff to use Chief now, only to have to retrain them on CDS in a few months' time, would be pointless, and considering better perhaps to stick with an intermediary now and then review the in-house option after Chief has been finally decommissioned and CDS is up and running and proving to work okay. Next slide, please. What information is needed? The basic export customs entry form must be completed and submitted to customs prior to shipment of the goods. Must be done prior to shipment. We call that a pre-entry, and some of the basic information on the form would be the details of the exporter, the intended destination of the goods, some accurate statistical information like weights and values. The government needs these for balance of trade figures, etc., statistical stuff. And quite importantly, the marks and numbers of the goods have to be clear so that the cargo can be identified if customs decide to check the cartons or the packages or actually open them for a physical examination. It's important to note that much of the data needed for the document can be gathered from the commercial invoice, which is issued by the overseas, issued to the overseas buyer by the UK exporter. A copy of this export invoice, and sometimes with a separate packing list if applicable, should be the first thing made available to the customs broker or the intermediary that you're using. Next slide, please. Now, what information must the exporter himself provide? We've established that the exporter gets an intermediary to do the document on the basis that the intermediary is hopefully an expert or a person with experience in these matters. Now, the exporter must apply to HMRC for an economic operator registration and identification number. This EORI number, people normally call that an EORI number, is crucial for identification purposes. And anyone considering importing or exporting must start from that point where they register with an EORI number. The exporter must decide the commodity code also, which defines the exact nature of the goods. This commodity code will ultimately decide the rate of duty or taxes, if any, that are applicable to the shipment in the country of destination. It is a massive legal responsibility of the exporter to classify his goods correctly. Now, a good customs broker will always be willing to advise and assist with the process, but classification is extremely important, and it's not enough for the exporter to say to his intermediary or broker, you go ahead, you're the expert, you go ahead and classify my goods. I can't emphasize enough how important it is that it's his legal responsibility, the exporter, and we as brokers or agents will give whatever help or assistance is required. Now, depending on the nature of the goods and the exact commodity code, export licensing could possibly be applicable, and if so, licenses must be applied for by the exporter himself, again with a bit of help from his broker. The license numbers have to be entered on the export declaration, otherwise the declaration won't go through. If the commodity code indicates a licensable commodity and you've got no export license number to hand to put on the document, the transaction will be rejected. Now, the exporter must define the customs procedure code also. Again, the customs broker can explain about customs procedures. An example of a customs procedure might be goods that are exported only to be re-imported again, or they're for military use overseas, or have some specific procedure that needs to be indicated to customs with the appropriate code. Next slide, please. Now, this submission of the export entry is sometimes thought to be the be-all and end-all of a customs export declaration, but it's referred to as pre-lodgement, and it represents only the first of 4 major steps in the export process. Next slide, please, for stage 2. So when the goods physically arrive at the port or airport or designated export place, an arrival message must be input to Chief by the carrier or loader of the goods at the place of export. Obviously, this message informs Chief and Customs that the goods are now at the place of export and are available for customs presentation and possibly inspection by HMRC. The arrival message must contain the special unique consignment reference number, UCR. This unique reference number will have been previously formulated by the person making the declaration. It will be entered on the pre-lodged customs export declaration, and it will ensure that the declaration is always matched with the correct shipment at the place of export. The UCR number is the equivalent in many ways and can be translated to become the barcode and the MRN that John's already mentioned. John was speaking about the people at the Ro-Ro port of shipment needing barcode MRN numbers. It's possible to go into the customs chief system, input the UCR number and ask for an export accompanying document, and that will give you these barcodes and MRNs. It's not always necessary these days, at the present time, to do this except for certain exports that go via EU countries. But remember, UCR equals barcode MRN in practical terms. Now, the arrival message indicates to customs the precise location of the goods and the date and time of acceptance at the export place. Next slide for stage 3. Okay. The chief system gets the arrival message and it re-examines and revalidates the data in the pre-lodged export declaration. And chief then will decide on what to do. It will either want the goods to be further inspected or the documents further inspected, or clearance will be given. So chief allocates a routing, and in most cases the routing will be an automatic permission to progress, and permission to progress means that the export entry has been cleared by customs and the goods may now progress to be loaded to the vessel or the plane. But if customs want to do further checks, a routing may call for the supporting documents to be looked at by customs, going back here to documents like the export invoice that we mentioned earlier. Or the goods could be physically examined by customs, possibly, before being accepted and permission to progress being given. A P2P permission to progress message is always sent electronically, and it's always sent to the person making the export declaration. So if you're the person doing the export documents, you will always know exactly when those goods are cleared for permission to progress. Next slide for stage 4. Right, the departure message is sent to chief. This is done by the port operator or the accountable person responsible for putting the goods on the vessel. It's a status called the loader in customs terms, and this departure message is important. It forms an integral part of the NES process. It provides customs with assurance that the goods have actually left the UK. Now, this is an important thing where exporters are claiming export refunds, duty reliefs, etc. You have to be sure that the goods have really left the UK. The message provides customs, HMRC, with the name of the departing vessel, flight number, trade reference, and various other bits of information that is required for this final departure and this closure of the stage 4 of the export process. Next slide, please. Okay, 1st of January 2021. Now, this is the date, as far as we know at the moment, is currently understood to be the day on which we have to be ready when all shipments of goods from the UK to EU destinations must be accompanied by a full export declaration. So, as far as we know, according to most recent government announcements, the whole 4 stages of customs export processing must be fully completed. There have been suggestions that that could be modified and there could be some loosening up of that, and something we'll come on to possibly later. For now, we have to assume that it's going to be the full process, and this is going to be difficult to do because it's generally believed that the overall number of export declarations will increase massively by 500% possibly, or even more. Next slide, please. I want to talk about time pressures. Deep sea exports to countries outside the EU are often shipped in containers. You're waiting to go on these massive container ships, and the containers might dwell on the quayside or at the port for a while before being uploaded to the vessel. And this process allows quite a lot of time for the export declaration and the export processing, so it can almost always be completed, in the course of a normal working day. But let's think about the huge volumes of declarations that might be required for exports to the EU. Because the short sea exports to countries within the EU are often carried on driver-accompanied trucks or curtain-sided trailers that move very quickly from the loading point in the UK to the Ro-Ro ferry port, maybe, London to Dover, very quick. On arrival at the port, the vehicles are routinely loaded almost immediately at the moment onto ferry crossings that operate, of course, around the clock, 24/7. So export entry clerks beyond 1121 must expect to be working under extreme time pressure, and out of hours attendance almost certain to be necessary, perhaps 3 shifts working to do this kind of work. Next slide, please. This is a personal observation of the situation. I'm rather old and a veteran of the pre-1993 import-export customs clearance procedures. We had 24-hour loading of trucks at inland depots and 24-hour ferry crossings, and it necessitated fast and efficient 24-hour customs processing for goods which were exported to the EU back then. Now, as long as there were Ro-Ro ferries operating 24/7, customs processing of vehicles to keep borders flowing was essential. Customs agents and brokers worked long shifts and very unsociable hours, and it appears right now that the UK somehow needs to mobilise tens of thousands of new shift workers who will be needed in the public sector to input the massive increase in customs declarations into the customs from 121. This new workforce would replace the many thousands of people who were sadly dismissed, who lost their jobs back in 1993. We also need to somehow quickly rebuild the infrastructure that existed at ports for processing EU trade pre-1993. I've heard port operators express particular concern about the huge volumes of export road freight that might arrive at the ports, especially at night. Worryingly, perhaps without the export pre-entries needed for the customs clearance and without the barcodes and the MRN that John mentioned. With no entry, no customs entry and no permission to progress, the vehicles will be unable to board the ferries. And without proper management of this situation, the feared gridlock at the ports, which we hope would never happen, could possibly come a reality. And we have to be sure to find solutions very quickly. Final slide, please, which is just a mention again of our business. George Baker, we are customs brokers in the UK, and I hope that some of the information I've given you will prove to be helpful. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much to George and to John for the presentations there. Lots of useful advice and information, I hope, for everybody who's listening. We're now going to answer some of our listeners' questions. As we said at the start, we won't be able to get through every single question we received today, as we've already been sent quite a few in advance. We will do our best, though, and we refer you to the Institute of Export's technical helpline if you are still having burning questions after this session that you would like to be answered. So, first question, I think to George. I've had a question in that asks, can you explain port of entry into EU markets after Brexit? And will we require an agent in each market? George.
The question suggests that the exporter is selling under DDP terms, delivered duty paid terms. It's meaning that he's taken responsibility for the import clearance in the country of EU destination, plus paying the duties, etc., and including that cost in the price of the goods. And lots of people operate in that way at the moment, and because there is no particular customs clearance needed, it's not a problem. But it can be tricky now, because you will indeed need an agent in each of the destination markets to do the customs clearance for you. Now, there are companies who have branches in all EU countries who might be a useful one-stop shop. I can think of a company called KGH who would provide such a service. But if this business of doing the clearance yourself, or arranging and paying the duties in the country of destination, becomes an issue, and you prefer to leave the import clearance in the hands of the buyer of the goods, then there are other terms that you might consider, other Incoterms like DAP or DPU. Have a look at Incoterms, Google Incoterms, and look at the new terms for 2020. And there's some good sites there that will help you understand, the process that belongs to each different option. I think that answers that, I hope.
Thanks, George. Right, we have another question. This one I think is for John to answer. How would one negotiate rates with the freight forwarders, and how does one identify various charges at the ports, such as wharfage, etc.? John.
I think George could probably comment on the wharfage better than I can, but in terms of negotiating freight rates with the freight forwarder, in the good old days, first find your freight forwarder. The problem at the moment is that the current freight forwarder community who can manage this on day one situation, they've got so much existing business that's going to convert overnight on the 31st that there doesn't seem to be a huge sort of appetite to taking on new customers and new business ahead of that date, until you go through the process of actually moving over all the current business into declarations, because obviously the amount of declarations is going to increase at 100%. I mean, they're talking about potentially 500 million declarations a year come next year. So getting customs agents is one thing, and getting a freight forwarder to move your freight is something else. And there's also a sign in the market now that UK exports declaration prices used to be very, very low, obviously because we have a massive imbalance in trade. Supply and demand dictates now this starting creeping up now. Although there's some possibilities now, and we're seeing sort of trends now where some, particularly if you're going to freight forwarders to do your custom declarations, they will probably be reluctant to just purely do declarations without carrying your freight as well, and doing the insurance and so on, because it's going to be a small, ever-decreasing number of forwarders that can actually carry out this business as we get towards the end of the year, and potentially if a little bit of panic seeps into the market as people start leaving it to the last minute to arrange negotiations with the freight forwarders. And obviously you might see some hardening of rates at the end of the year then, as we run towards the deadline on the 31st of December. But as with all these things, you need to go to the market right now. You need to see which forwarders, which agents are dealing with the countries that you're going to, and who can move the particular type of goods that you're exporting. And obviously, we're seeing if we start and if you're exporting agri products, we've got the added complication there now that you need someone who understands the process for doing the inspections of the agricultural products, the border control points, processes, and so on and so on. So there are lots of more points within the supply chain going to be required. So if you're moving agri products, you don't just need your customs declarations. You're going to need a representative in the port, say in Calais. You're going to possibly need a representative in the border inspection points, wherever it is in France, that's going to be able to handle your particular type of goods, and so on and so on. So it's going to be quite depending on you. I would say the answer is really depending on what products you're exporting will determine how much leverage you would have with the forwarders who can move it. But obviously, it's very much in terms of supply and demand, it's in the freight forwarders' hands at the moment. I'm sure there will be more opportunities or opportunists brokers coming into the market as the year progresses. Now we know for sure that they're going to be customs agents, because, as I said before, there's 17 port agents in Dover now. There was 220 in 1993 when we last had customs. So there's bound to be movements in the market on this, but there's no time like the present to start doing negotiations now, and just basically seeing who will actually agree to move your goods, and narrow that down to a pool of 3 or so, and do your usual negotiating. Thank you.
Yeah, George here. Just to George speaking, just to say quickly that there are certain charges which will apply which are not really negotiable with the forwarder. The person who makes the import entry or the export entry is automatically billed by the port normally for certain disbursements such as security fees, infrastructure fees, presentation fees, etc., which would generally be announced on the port website. And the agent concerned, because he's your agent, is going to collect these charges and has no option but to bill them to you at cost in addition to his normal fees. And that's something to remember. Thank you.
Thanks both John and George there for a very comprehensive answer to that question. I think another one that could be for George. The question is asking, will Ro-Ro freight be arrived at by the loader at the port and granted permission to progress, or will permission to progress be granted inland at the exporter's premises?
Right, this is a good question, because last year when we were preparing for these cliff edge no deal scenarios that we had to suffer, the government announced various easements to the process, just to make the border process less daunting if the worst happened. And there was talk of granting permission to progress without the loader arriving the cargo, that the shipper could, the exporter could actually arrive that, or his agent could arrive that cargo himself. It was an easement that was anticipated. However, the government is now saying that there will be no such easements for 1/1/21. We must wait and see what happens, but we have to prepare for the possibility that the full 4 steps that I mentioned earlier of the export process will, have to be completed. That's how it is.
Well, thanks very much for that answer again, George. I think we've got time just to squeeze one last quick question in, possibly for John. And the question is asking, what will happen about ICS data and who will be responsible for it?
I'm assuming the question is about safety and security declarations, which we know now are going to be 100% required. There's going to be no easements on safety and security for imports, and we know they're definitely going to need them for exports. For exports, it's slightly easier than imports because there's only one declaration. So the correct me if I'm wrong here, George, but the customs declaration also includes the data for the safety and security declaration. The complication is here now, really. And certainly, we've heard that the Spanish customs authorities will be expecting safety and security declarations for empty trailers, which apparently goes outside the boundaries of other people's understanding on it. In terms of liability, it's the carrier. So if it's a driver of a company truck, and the safety and security liability is with the haulier, if it's an unaccompanied trailer, it then reverts to the carrier, which in that case will be the ferry company or the train company, or however the trailer is moving. So therein lies the problem. If you start to look into the trucking industry throughout Europe, there's absolutely no way the vast majority of them will be able to do a safety and security declaration to any customs authority in the EU or in the UK, and so on and so on. So this again is another small detail at the moment, which will become a bigger problem if it's not addressed, and how the haulage sector is going to actually be able to do their own safety and security declarations, if that's going to be required. I say it's probably more of a problem for imports, because if exports will be having a by default having a customs declaration done, which will also incorporate the safety and security declaration. So I hope that answers I hope that's the right answer to the right question.
Thanks very much, John. And on that note, we've pretty well run out of time. Apologies to people who sent us questions that we just didn't have time to get around to. Please do consider contacting the Institute of Export and International Trade to see if they can help you with some of these questions. As a reminder, you can download the slides via the handout drop down in the control panel. Next slide, please. Our next webinar will be looking at the importance of protecting intangible assets such as IP, trademarks and copyright. It's with Liz Ward from Virtuoso Legal. That's taking place on the 19th of March, and you can find sign-up details at open2export.com webinars. Next slide, please. The Institute of Export and International Trade will be running several Brexit-related training courses throughout 2020. Of course, many of which can be funded by the recontinued government grant funding from HMRC. This is designed to help businesses learn key customs processes. The funding pot is limited, so don't miss out on the opportunity to effectively learn core export skills that will be needed post-Brexit. And you can learn these pretty well for free at HMRC's expense. We've also got our annual graduation ceremony coming up in May in London. This is a great opportunity to network and meet recently certified global trade professionals. So do come along to that, as our graduates really are experts in an increasingly important field. You can find details of all our training courses and events at export.org.uk. And finally, please consider membership of the Institute of Export and International Trade. As we enter a new era of trade, it's really important that we support each other and share information wisdom around best practicing global trade and the challenges ahead. Membership of the Institute gives you a support network and a wealth of information to ensure that you have everything you need to meet the challenges of global trade. Benefits include access to our technical helpline for questions such as the ones we've answered today, industry recognition of your exporting credentials, a wealth of online information and daily bulletins about all the key trade issues, networking opportunities and events, and so much more. To find out more about membership of the Institute, please do look at our website, export.org.uk/membership, and our membership services team will always be happy to answer any questions that you may have. That's all from us today. We hope that you found today's webinar useful, and please do take our exit survey to let us know what you thought, and feel free to get in touch about any queries around global trade you may have. Till next time, goodbye.